In this lesson, we'll talk about the following topics: how to use dynamic screening to block connections addressed to too many invalid recipients, blocking servers that connect too often in a given time frame, blocking connections that fail too many authentication attempts, blocking servers that send too many connection resets, and configuring exclusions. Security Gateway has a variety of tools that can block connections based on suspicious behavior. For example, somebody trying to connect too many times in a given time frame, somebody trying to guess recipients, things like that. So there are a couple of tools that we'll talk about. We'll talk about dynamic screening in this lesson, but there are other tools available, such as account hijack detection as well. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about the dynamic screening feature in Security Gateway, which you'll find under the anti-abuse section under the security menu. So with dynamic screening, what this feature allows you to do is block suspicious activity based on the behavior of the connection. For example, this first option here, ban IPs who caused this many failed RCPT attempts. What this means is when you send an email message, the sending mail server sends to the receiving mail server a command called RCPT2. And that basically designates the recipient. So for example, if I want to send an email to 3 people, John, Fred, and George, the commands sent would be RCPT2 John, RCPT2 Fred, and RCPT2 George, and so forth. So a separate RCPT command for each recipient. And in this instance, if a given number of those recipients are invalid, in other words, the RCPT command fails because the account does not actually exist in Security Gateway, then typically what happens is spammers will populate lots of invalid recipients in their spam messages and then just try to send those spam messages out to whoever they can. So if Security Gateway receives one of these messages from a spammer containing multiple invalid recipients, in other words, again, the spammer is just trying to throw in random addresses, or perhaps they got an old database or an old address list of addresses that are no longer valid. Security Gateway will count the number of recipient commands that are addressed to invalid addresses, and then once it reaches a certain threshold, it will ban the IP address, because at that point we know that the sender is just trying to guess recipients and send out random spam. So after 10 of those, Security Gateway will ban the IP address. And by default, those IP addresses will be banned for the number of minutes that you designate down here under ban IPs for this many minutes. So in this case, the IP address would be banned from connecting again for the next 10 minutes. And in addition to IPs that cause a certain number of failed recipient commands, you can also ban IPs that connect a certain number of times in a given time frame. So you can ban IP addresses that keep trying to connect multiple times in a given time frame and thereby tying up your system resources. You can ban that type of activity. Likewise, you can also ban IP addresses that fail a given number of authentication attempts. So they're just trying to guess passwords, they're putting in the wrong information, they're guessing the wrong password, and if they do that a given number of times under the authentication step in the process, then the IP address will be banned, again, for the designated number of minutes that you specify here. You can also ban connections from IP addresses that send too many reset commands. A hacker or cybercriminal might send a reset command to try to keep an SMTP connection open while they continue to try to guess passwords or try to perform other malicious acts. So this allows you to limit the number of reset commands that Security Gateway will accept before it bans the IP address and prevents it from connecting again for a given period of time. And I'll show you how to identify that in the message log. So if we go to the messages queues menu here, and then we go up to all messages and go to the message log, here is an example of a connection that was rejected due to too many reset commands. You can see that right here under the reason column, and we can actually double click on it to view more details. If we scroll down, for example, these are the 3 reset commands that were allowed before Security Gateway closed the connection and blocked further attempts from this connection. Once an IP address is banned, you can also optionally check this box to close the SMTP session after that IP is banned, and that will free up some of your system resources. Now you can configure exclusions to the dynamic screening feature based on whether the message is from a whitelisted IP address or host, or whether it was from an authenticated session, or from one of your designated domain mail servers. Any IPs that have been banned will show up in the banned IPs list down here. So this is a test server that I have running here, but I'll show you what it looks like on my live server when a connection is banned based on dynamic screening. So here's my message log for my live server. And you can see the messages that were rejected based on dynamic screening. So we'll just pick one, for example. This one right here was rejected for dynamic screening. If we double click on it and we scroll down, we can see why. They have reached, in this case, the sender has reached their failed authentication dynamic screening threshold, and then the connection was refused by dynamic screening. You can get further clues as to what happened with this connection by noticing, for example, the IP address that it came from. So 4513399.130 had already tried to connect here, and here, and here, and here. So on the 5th attempt, Security Gateway rejected it, dynamic screening kicked in, and the IP address was banned. And on my live server, if I go back to my dynamic screening configuration screen, you can see all the IP addresses that were banned by dynamic screening by this feature. You can also optionally remove them from the banned list if they happen to be a legitimate connection.